Hello, everybody. Good day, and welcome to Pacific Northwest History, lesson number 2. We are going to be talking about something that you guys all probably have heard about before, and one thing that when you think of Pacific Northwest history, you're going to learn about it at some point. It's the Lewis and Clark expedition. So we're going to be talking about that in depth today. And next week, too, we're going to learn more about it with a series of documents from the people who lived and experienced it firsthand. So this is going to be a big part of our class this and next week. So the United States explorers, let's get some background before we get to Lewis and Clark. The three major expeditions during this time that the United States of America ends up doing. The first one is by Captain Robert Gray. That's in 1792. They have Lewis and Clark, the famous one, 1804 to 1806. That's going to be the one that you guys are going to have to remember the best, and make sure to remember those dates as well. And then finally we have Lieutenant Charles Wilkes. That's much later in 1841. Ends up exploring a lot of the Pacific and a lot of the West Coast as well. But let's start with Gray's expedition. He was the one who actually claimed the Columbia River and found the mouth of it, and actually brought the U.S. to the forefront of exploration of the PNW. So remember, this part of the world at this time, many people it was kind of up for grabs. The United States was new on the scene, but the British were also pretty far north. Over here, they're the ones who started, claiming places like Vancouver Island, and establishing places in what are now Canada. So it was unsure about what country that this part of the world would really become a part of. But after Gray's expedition and the Lewis and Clark expedition, it becomes clear that it's really the United States of America who want it the most. Here's a map at this time. You can see Vancouver Island claimed by the English, claimed by the British here. You can see the border here where Canada is now, and the United States is down here. Alright, so here's some world history background for the Lewis and Clark expedition. So you're going to all learn about this way more next year, at near the end of your world history class with me when you're all sophomores. But for now, let's just have a very, very, very fast historical background for the Lewis and Clark expedition. So the French Revolution. Like I said many times, you can have a whole class just on this. Here's the French Revolution in about 1 minute. French peasants execute King Louis XVI. Why did they do this? Well, they were not very happy with him for what direction the country was going, and the fact that many people were having struggles, especially with feeding their families. There is a revolution that began, and France enters the Reign of Terror. This is where many kind of many ideologically driven guys end up kind of taking over France, and it is not good. And this is where you have a lot of public executions with things like the guillotine. After this period of chaos, a young man named Napoleon ends up taking control. He's in the army, and the army ends up having kind of like this military dictatorship over France after the chaos of the Reign of Terror. He began a period of wars in Europe, which were pretty expensive, and so France also during this time acquires Louisiana, territory from Spain. So they have all this new territory in America, but Napoleon's not very interested in America. He's more focused on European conquest. However, during this time, Thomas Jefferson becomes the president of the United States in 1800, and the United States has an interest in the port of New Orleans because it had all the grain from the Midwest was sailed down the Mississippi River here. Here's the outline of the Mississippi River, biggest river in North America. All the grain that was being grown up here was sailing down the river and went through New Orleans, which is at the very mouth of the river down here. The United States really wanted that city, but it was technically owned by the French at this time. So President Jefferson sent 3 men to France, and they offered to pay $7 million just for the city of New Orleans, because the United States really wanted it. However, Napoleon kind of played the reverse Uno card and offered all of Louisiana territory for $15 million. You can see that's all this area here. Remember, he wasn't really interested in having land in North America. He wanted to focus on Europe. So he said, hey, if you guys want all this stuff, I'm not going to use it anyway. I need this money right away. So he offered them a very, very good deal. And this is some of now what's known as the most productive farmland in the whole world. So the United States got quite the deal on the Louisiana Purchase. However, when it comes to all this new territory that the United States got, or the Oregon country over here, as the Pacific Northwest was called at the time, we really didn't know what was over here. So Thomas Jefferson ends up sending 2 people, Lewis and Clark, along with an expedition of about 30 other men, to really help understand what's out here. And you can see all the states that would be established after the Lewis and Clark expedition, but we didn't have any of these as real states yet. The farthest one was over here in Missouri, because the expedition is going to start here in the city of St. Louis. So here are the expedition goals. They want to collect information about the plants and animals of the Louisiana Territory and the Pacific Northwest. And they want to map major features and find the sources of the Columbia and the Missouri rivers. As you can see here, rivers are a very, very important part of the American landscape and in world history in general. All the great cities in the world, as you'll probably figure out if you've ever been to them, all the major cities in the world usually either sit right on the coast, right along an ocean, or are by a river somehow. And so rivers are very important to world history. So you can see the Mississippi River going up here. The Missouri River was attached to it. And eventually they're going to follow a lot of these rivers into what is now the Pacific Northwest. They want to establish good relations with the Native Americans because we didn't really know the tribes that were over here yet. They wanted to prove or disprove rumors about the region. There were all sorts of crazy stories going on about what it was like over here, and they wanted to see if it was true. They wanted to determine the extent of the Louisiana Territory. Remember, there's no GPS. There's no super accurate globes. This whole area over here was unknown, so they really wanted to figure out how big the territory really was. And they wanted to strengthen the claim of the United States to the PNW. So these were all very, very important expedition goals. All right, so here's the trip to the Pacific. You can see what it looks like without all the state borders. They start here in St. Louis and end up following the rivers. And these areas here, you can see it was a little bit different. They actually split up when they were going back home. But when they were going to the Pacific Ocean to begin with, they stayed together the whole way. They began from St. Louis in May of 1804. They made it to Fort Mandan, which is now in North Dakota, for their first winter. So it took them quite a bit just to get up here from St. Louis. So it took them a long time just to reach here. And then 1805 is the action-packed year. This is where they meet Sacagawea, who will become very, very important to this whole story. She was a teenage girl from the Shoshone tribe. She was sold into marriage to a French fur trader who joined the expedition named Charbonneau. Charbonneau, yes, bought her and another girl to be his wives. This is something you probably might have heard differently when you were younger, but she wasn't quite a slave. I wouldn't quite go that far, but she was sold into marriage against her will. So it's something to remember when we're talking about Sacagawea. However, she was extremely helpful to the expedition. Originally, it was just Charbonneau who joined the expedition, and he kind of brought her along, but she ended up becoming much more important than he was because she was very helpful in terms of her survival skills, and she knew the territory better than anybody on the expedition, so she became extremely important to the success of it. She even met up with her long-lost brother, who assisted the expedition cross the Rockies in a pretty crazy coincidence, or fate. It was pretty amazing that they were able to meet up because they hadn't seen each other in years. So when she was able to meet her brother again, that was very good news for the expedition. He ended up helping them cross the Rockies, which was one of the most difficult parts of the whole journey. In the spring of 1805, they continued up the Missouri River to its headwaters in Montana, and then they crossed the Rocky Mountains with the help of the Nez Perce Indians, who gave them 29 horses. The Nez Perce were extremely helpful during this time as well, and the only reason they were able to speak to them is because they had somebody, Sacagawea, who could speak to them and knew their language. And here are the very helpful directions that they got. Follow the rivers. The rivers are very important to this whole story. The Nez Perce gave them directions for the easiest way to the Pacific Ocean, so just remember these directions. So first, you take the Clearwater River in Idaho, follow that all the way up, and then when you get to where the Snake River is, that's where there's two cities to this day, called Lewiston, Idaho, and Clarkston, Washington. So once you get there, follow the Snake River to what is now Pasco, Washington, in the Tri-Cities, and then that's where you meet up with another river, the Columbia. You get to take the Columbia River after that, and because of the way that it flows, you can just ride a canoe down the whole thing all the way till you get to the Pacific Ocean. You really can't miss it once you get there. So those were kind of the directions that they got, and they're extremely helpful. Just follow the rivers all the way to the ocean. Here's a picture of Lewiston and Clarkston to this day, and you can see this is where the Snake River is, and you can see that's the border now between Washington and Idaho. The expedition stayed over the winter of 1805 and 1806 in Fort Clatsop, near modern-day city of Astoria, Oregon. And I think many of you have actually gone here on a field trip. But yeah, you can see what it was like to live during this time in a fort over the winter when you're in an unfamiliar land, you don't know what's going on all around you near the coast. As you guys probably know, if you've been to the coast in Oregon, it gets pretty cold. The return. All right, they return to St. Louis much faster. They get back in just a few months. Only takes them about 9 months to get back. September 23rd, 1806, they get back to St. Louis, Missouri, and they're hailed as heroes. Overall, they traveled 8,000 miles, and both men, when they finished, I think they were both around the ages of 32 and 36, so they still had life ahead of them, but they ended up having kind of sad and tragic lives after the expedition. But today, they're remembered for their bravery, and, really helping establish the United States' presence in the Pacific Northwest. And I have a picture here of a famous book that was written not too long ago about the expedition, which you can read much more in depth. It's recommended. Stephen Ambrose is a good author. So that's all I have to say about that today. That's kind of the big overview of the Lewis and Clark expedition. And this week and next week, we're going to be reading, the documents of the people who actually lived through it. And we're going to see kind of their ideas about the whole thing. So join me next time for that. All right. Bye, everyone.